Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I think it's good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the Impact of Apprenticeship Assessment Changes. So in this session, we're looking at proposed changes to apprenticeship assessment reforms and outline some of the concerns raised by employers across the science industries and find out what they could mean for our sector and for your business. For those not familiar with Cogent Skills, we are the sector-led employer voice for the science industries. We believe collaboration is key to resolving skills challenges. And we support a number of sector-specific working groups in nuclear and the science industries. And these groups give employers a real voice in championing skills reform and influencing national strategies. In terms of some of the changes that will be mentioned today, we'll be putting forward a letter to ministers on behalf of employers, outlining concerns and looking at a number of ways in which employers can directly voice their concerns at the proposals too. For more information, if you'd like to get involved in any of those collaborative groups, email us, and I'll pop the email address in the chat function of the screens shortly. Just some housekeeping for today's session. It's been recorded. A copy of that recording will be made available afterwards. Lines are on mute, but if you've got any questions, pop them through in the Q&A function. And hopefully we've got some time at the end, I think, for Q&A and a bit of chat. In terms of today's speaker, it's a dramatic last-minute change to the starting 11, but we're delighted to be joined by Justine Foch, Group CEO of Cogent Skills. Justine has spent over 20 years championing skills development and is a passionate advocate for vocational and technical education, helping open doors for people and businesses alike. During her time at Cogent Skills has driven some of the UK's most critical workforce strategies, from nuclear and life sciences to clean energy, and co-founded the Hydrogen Skills Alliance to tackle skills challenges of our energy transition. Justine also works closely with government and industry to shape policy across life sciences, chemicals and low carbon sectors. Before joining, Justine has held senior roles in food and drink manufacturing. When she's not leading the charge on skills, I believe you'll find her playing hockey, walking the dog, or running. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Justine.
Goodness, thank you very much for that build-up, Roger. I don't walk the dog, play hockey, and run all at the same time. But just to be clear, right? Welcome. We've got a lot to get through today, and I'm standing in for policy colleagues, who are unfortunately not available today. So I am a pale imitation of their expertise, but I will do my very best to steer us through an understanding of the reforms. So just very, very quickly, what are we talking about? So the apprenticeship assessment reforms that are going to be taking place next year, they represent one of the most substantial changes to apprenticeship policy that we've seen for some time. Fundamentally, it's a move away from the current model of endpoint assessment and towards not a single model, but a variable model of different approaches that might be taken to different apprenticeships based on a number of different reasons or rationales. What I thought it'd be really important to do is actually just to go all the way back to the beginning and remind ourselves, I guess, of where we are now in apprenticeships versus perhaps where we've been over the past sort of 10 years or so. So prior to the system we have now, we had a system where an apprenticeship was made up of a range of learning outcomes. So you had things like personal learning, English and maths, and you had a qualification, usually a competence-based qualification, where the learner was assessed by the training provider under rigorous quality assurance by an awarding organisation. And the aim of that system was to make people job ready. So units of qualifications were very much specifically tailored for the jobs that people were going to do. Training providers delivered the training, and as I say, awarding organisations quality assured them. Following something called the Richards Review, which was a fundamental review published by the previous government, things changed very dramatically. And the idea was that providers would be freed up to be far more innovative in the delivery of the learning. Qualifications were largely removed. And the idea was that it didn't matter how you were taught, how you learnt. At the end of the day, you had to pass a test at the end, which was an endpoint assessment. And that was based not on a job, but on an occupation. So a standard description of what you should be able to do in that occupation. And the occupation was knowledge, skills, and behaviours. And the reason and part of the rationale for this change was the belief that it would be more innovative for providers and allow them to focus on the training, but you needed to have a check and the balance in the system. So an independently delivered assessment that didn't just test some of the knowledge, skills, and behaviours, but tested them all. And they were tested by developing an assessment plan, which employers were very driven and created trailblazer groups to make sure that the learning, that the outcomes of that learning were exactly what they needed for those occupations. So quite a big move. And what we'll see as we go through today is that we're sort of moving to a bit of a hybrid model now, where it's a little bit more like the first model, the previous model, but arguably with not the same level of verification and validation in there that we had in the previous model. So let's just talk about, I guess, some of those, what we know, what's been announced by government. So there's been a timeline of announcements. So earlier this year, some of the assessment principles were being talked about and some pilots were undertaken. They were started to look at a different model of assessing apprentices on programme. There was some guidance issued in October, and then we also started to see the first versions of what these new apprenticeships might look like, because three standards were published and made available, so everybody in the system could start to see what was involved. And we've had, since November, Skills England doing a number of roundtables. I think it's fair to say that there's been quite a lot of concern raised, and Roger alerted to it earlier, that actually these new standards don't have the rigour attached that we've had in either of the previous two systems. So why reform? What's been the basis of it? Well, the official line on the reform is very much around about it's cutting down bureaucracy, and it's all about getting greater value for apprentices and employers. So in the current system, you may have a learner who's learning. They're being assessed by the training provider, quite rightly. Are they making progress? Are they getting closer to being able to demonstrate the knowledge, skills, and behaviours that are required of them at the end of the programme? And to what extent are they doing that? Are they doing that at a pass level, or are they doing that at distinction? So they'll be assessed on the job. If there's a qualification in their standard, they'll be assessed and have to pass that qualification. And then that all leads up to the end assessment, where they're being assessed again, finally for that end assessment and being graded at the end of it. So the argument is there's quite a lot of assessment happening. Can we make it simpler for apprentices and employers? The other driver for this is because you're doing sometimes a qualification and then having to stay on and be assessed again for an apprenticeship. Is there a way of reducing the amount of assessment so that completion rates might go up? So completion rates in apprenticeships are around about 60% just now. So that means that for every 100 people who start an apprenticeship, only about 60 actually get to the end. So part of the driver has been around improving the completion rates. But we've also heard that it's about maintaining rigour and quality. Although, as I said earlier, and as we'll have a look at in a minute, there's some real question marks about that. What has not been mentioned as a key policy goal, but I think is becoming very evident, is that there's also a driver to reduce the costs, to save some money in the apprenticeship system. And that hasn't been more widely publicised, but we do believe from the conversations that we've had and some of the conversations we've heard have taken place elsewhere, that is also a big driver. But you can see very much the kind of published rationale is about overcoming significant administration obstacles and overly complex, burdensome and time-consuming approaches. And I think there is some truth in the fact that some of the apprenticeships that have been designed have got a lot of assessment in them, but it's by no means all of them. So what are those changes? And this chart is quite complicated, so bear with me. I'll explain all of these changes. So first of all, timing. We're not talking about having a single delivered endpoint assessment anymore. We're talking about a system where assessment will take place on programme, so whilst the learner is learning. So as well as that, who is doing the assessment? So currently it's been done very much by a different organisation to the training provider who is assessing. Now the training provider will be able to do some of that assessment, and they'll be able to mark some of the assessments and determine whether a learner has reached the standard that's required or not. Whereas in the past, that was done, that the quality assurance of that system was done by awarding organisations, it's being done by assessment organisations. Now, those end assessment organisations have been set up to undertake the assessment themselves, not necessarily to quality assure other people undertaking those assessments. So we're seeing quite a different approach coming through. In addition to that, behaviours are no longer going to be independently assessed. It will be the job of the employer to determine whether the learner has reached the standard that they're looking for from behaviours. It's not clear yet from any of the guidance we've had how that will be standardised. So how one employer's version of reaching the right level of behaviours might be standardised against another employer's, and how that could even feed into a final grading. Currently, particularly in the science industries, safety behaviour is really, really important, and it's put on a premium. There are some standards where you can't even get a distinction unless you have a distinction in your behaviours. So it's really important for our industries. And it's not clear from the reforms how that will be fed in and whether it will count in any way towards a learner's end mark. So in addition, the plans that are going to be assessed against, currently, I made the point that the assessment plans are quite rigorous. It says exactly what will be delivered by the end assessment organisation, and all end assessment organisations use the same plan. They use the same techniques and methods. In the new system, there's going to be a less prescriptive approach, and those assessment organisations can choose different ways of approaching it. In addition to which, not all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours will be assessed. We'll see in a minute, but it can be around about 40%. And organisations can choose potentially what those assessments might cover. So rather than every assessment organisation saying to the providers, these are the specifics that you will have to assess against, you might get very different offers from different organisations. One person saying, these are the knowledge and skills that I'm going to test, I think are really important, and another one saying there's a different set for us. And I think an interesting analogy to this is the driving test. So it's a similar model that was introduced. So if we don't mind who does the learning, how the learning is achieved, but at the end, there's a single test. I know if I knew that one testing agency weren't going to test me on my 3-point turn, but another one was, I might be tempted to go to the one who didn't test me on my 3-point turn, because I might not be so good at that. So that's the kind of variability we're talking about might come into it in terms of assessment. Hence the sampling point assessment organisations can choose. We know that the duration of apprenticeships can be moved now from 12 months to 8 months. And what we're also talking about happening in these assessment changes is a much more simplified grading. So it'll usually be pass or distinction, whereas currently you can have pass, merit and distinction. Functional skills, we know, are optional for over 19s. That's been there for a while. But there's a lot of focus also on using technology and encouraging the best use of technology and digital tools. So what might that look like when you think about all those different changes? Is there a standard model that's going to be introduced for end assessment, or for assessment as we're calling it now? Well, actually, there's 3 different types that are being looked at. So I'm going to start with number 3 first, which is mandatory qualification. So if currently in a standard, there is a mandatory qualification that every apprentice needs to do, the idea is that you will no longer have any assessment other than the assessment of the qualification. So if they pass their qualification, that will cover everything they need to know, and there'll be no further assessments required. Going back to the other area, number 1, standard low prescription plans. This is the way that most apprentices are going to be approached. A very much minimal prescription. So there'll be a small assessment, might be able to be carried out by the training provider or the end assessment organisation, but more likely to be the training provider, and it won't require all the knowledge, skills and behaviours to be assessed. There'll be flexibility for that awarding organisation to decide which ones are going to be tested. And then there's a second one, which is really for more safety critical or regulated occupations, where you may have an additional mandatory element. So a way of trying to ensure that more compliance and safety is built in through a slightly more prescriptive approach. So as I said, we're not going to one model for the future. We're going for 3 different approaches to that. The interesting, I think, thing that we'll see when we come on to timings is when might this take place? Because again, normally when you have such a massive change to the kind of the way things are, it's managed in a very forward-looking way, i.e. when a new learner starts, we'll start to introduce these. The intention is that these are introduced very quickly. So mandatory qualifications, if there is one already in an apprenticeship and a learner is undertaking it, may well be introduced in the next 3 months. So these changes aren't just theoretical, will happen some point in the future. These are very real and are going to happen fairly quickly. What terminology might we expect to hear? So currently we talk about endpoint assessment. It's now going to be apprenticeship assessment. We talk about endpoint assessment organisations, and they're going to be called apprenticeship organisations or assessment organisations. We talk about gateway being the process by which somebody finishes and have got all the evidence that they're ready to come to be tested. It's going to be called the gateway to completion. And most importantly, for the employers who've been heavily involved in designing apprenticeships, the trailblazer groups that have traditionally overseen the development of the standards and the development of the assessment plans are no longer going to be required. There's going to be something called an expert pool or a group of persons, which will consist of training providers, awarding organisations, other stakeholders and employers. So quite a different approach even to the design of those apprenticeships and those standards. In terms of organisational roles, you can see, I won't talk through this slide, but you can see very much that the responsibility for apprenticeships has moved over to the Department for Work and Pensions, along with skills more generally for adults. Skills England will be looking at the practical implementation and the development and approval of those new assessment plans. And they've been directed to take a pro-employer approach, which sounds very positive, but previously it was very much driven by employers. And so a slight difference in the kind of language that we're hearing. Ofqual and the Office for Students will be responsible for the quality assurance of apprenticeships, and employers will be very much responsible for reviewing the occupational expertise and verifying apprentices' behaviours. So you will have a formal role if you're an employer now to verify that somebody has met a learner has met the required behaviours. And providers and assessment organisations will work in partnership. Training providers will mark certain assessment elements, and assessment organisations will develop these flexible materials and process to ensure more quality and consistency. So that's all the changes. Let's just talk about some of the concerns that have been raised. So first of all, assessment sampling. So if you're not going to test all the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are in an occupational standard, how will you know for sure that a learner has reached that level? Now, some of the pilot schemes that I mentioned before, 5 of them took place. 2 of them weren't successful and haven't been issued in terms of the results of those. But the ones that we have seen, only 40% of the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are listed on the standard are actually assessed in this new model. The second area is mandatory qualification. So as I mentioned before, if a standard has a mandatory qualification, that is the only assessment that's going to be there. Now, sometimes a mandatory qualification is included and it doesn't cover all the knowledge, skills and behaviour. It might be there because it covers one aspect that's very, very important. So there's a question mark about who is looking at those mandatory questions to be reassured that they cover all the learning that's needed for the learner to be adequately competent. And as I mentioned before, given that these are the ones that are going to be introduced very quickly, there's mounting concern that the level of scrutiny that's required to make sure that those mandatory qualifications are good enough is not necessarily there. And then the final one is the removal of independent behaviour assessments. So now only the employer is really responsible for verifying apprentices' behaviours. Now, on the surface, absolutely, employers have a huge role. You employ the individual, you will have a view as to whether or not they are reaching the level that you're looking for in terms of the behaviours. But we are concerned, I think, and a number of people are concerned, that there is no independent assessment of that. And if you're taking on an apprentice that's come from a different company, you'll want to be reassured that the behaviours that you consider to be at a level are the same as somebody else's. So there will be an opportunity to ask questions. I'll come to the end of it, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. So just give me 2 seconds. I'm nearly at the end of the slides. So the safety critical nature of our industry, we've had the construction industry being very heavily involved in one of the pilots, and they've raised considerable concern around about the approach that's been taken. So is the adult care trailblazer. So those two groups have pointed to the risk of sampling and the risk to patient care and safety. And also the professional bodies and certification schemes that operate in construction. So they may well withdraw recognition if there's not a better way of approaching things, so that the apprentice can demonstrate the level of competence needed to verify those kind of certificates. I think one of the other big concerns, and we are in particularly view this as a concern because we're very much driven by and here for our employers, is that this whole approach seems to be being bulldozed through. When you have such a massive change to a system, one would have thought that there would have been a consultation, that there would have been evidence provided, that there would have been engagement with employers for whom apprentices are absolutely critical, and after all, who pay for apprenticeships, that this would have been a major engagement process before now. But it does feel very much like these are being driven through very quickly, very much under the radar, and not with employers being consulted properly. And I think we are really concerned that employers are not being listened to and the concerns are not being raised. I guess what are the key messages from all of this? What does this mean? So first of all, I think to the point, they seem to be ill thought through and untested and potentially driven by a different agenda. I don't think anybody would disagree that we want to make apprenticeships a really high quality program of learning with good assessment, and we don't want to overdo the assessment. But at the same time, it's not about saving money and taking cost out. And if that is the driver, then there may be different ways of approaching apprenticeships rather than this approach. So I think we would say, where is the evidence? Provide the evidence that we hear that employers have fed back, they're concerned about over-assessment. Let's have a look at that evidence and just understand. It might be different for other sectors, but for our sector, we get very little feedback around about the need for change. We'd like to understand and see the feedback and the lessons learned from some of the trials that have gone on to now, and how have those led to improvements being made. I think really importantly, the reforms need to reaffirm the need for full involvement by employers. In the early days of Trailblazers, it was always really important to have a full suite of different types of employers, larger employers, smaller employers, to make sure that the apprenticeship standards were workable for all employers and all employers in different sectors. And we're just not seeing that from this new group of persons that's being described. The pace feels really fast, and I would argue that we want any reforms to be very much engaging employers, engaging all stakeholders, and to result in something successful. So it does feel it just needs to slow down, take the time, and let's get everybody involved. And I think confirm how funding is going to be affected. So we hear that once these new policies and new processes are fed through, that there will be a review of funding taking place. And our suspicion is that that will reduce funding because no end assessment is going to be taking place anymore. So let's have some honesty and clarity around about where is this funding going? I think the other key messages are really about quality. So endpoint assessment organisations were established to deliver their own independent endpoint assessments. They weren't created to validate training providers doing that. So I would like to understand just how are we going to make sure that those organisations will quality assure the providers who are delivering their assessments, because it's a slightly different model and a different skill set. Who and how are the mandated qualifications going to be checked to make sure that they are covering the areas that are really critical? Safety critical industries need a rigorous end assessment. We want to maintain that for our industries because safety is absolutely paramount. I think a number of employers have fed back that what we would want to see is the full range of knowledge, skills and behaviours being covered. And behaviours need some form of standardisation. If you're going to take a learner from another organisation who's completed their apprenticeship, you want to know that their definition of operating safely is the same as yours, and that that's the behaviour standard that they have met. I think for apprenticeships to remain utilised and valued, fundamentally, you as employers have got to have trust in the system. So you need to be engaged. You've already put a lot of time and effort into creating fantastic standards and good endpoint assessment plans. So let's have proper consultation and engagement. And we're here to help government do that, but I think we really want to see that. If the pilots have not been successful, there isn't proof of concept that these are going to work, and it would be really dangerous to embark on a major change programme without having proof of concept. And I think fundamentally, we risk a race to the bottom. Different organisations offering different sampling regimes means that providers may well only train people for the 40% of knowledge, skills and behaviours that are going to be tested. Why would you bother training the other 60% if you're not going to be tested on it in the end? So for all of those reasons, we think there are some real concerns in the system. What's yet to come? I mentioned earlier on the lead-in periods. If you look at number 2, most standards, this will take effect in the next 6 months. They'll be introduced. For the complex standards, some of the ones in the science industries, it might take up to 12 months. But if you have a learner doing a qualification that's mandated in an apprenticeship standard, in the next 3 months, they will be expected to move on to this. So the conversations that you'll have had about, you'll have an endpoint assessment, etc., they will become redundant in the next 3 months. As we know, there's been a pilot phase, so we are looking to have those pilots paused and to look at how we can sort of move forward with a different model that will work. The other thing that we have just worth bringing to employers' attention is what was in the budget, which is that the removal of the 10% top-up and levy funds are now going to expire after 12 months. So again, when we're thinking about what's the driver for some of these changes, we're seeing that increasingly money that's in companies' levy pots that have been in there for more than 12 months are going to expire, which effectively means government will take that money back. But the third point on this is something that we're really concerned about, that government will work with employers to streamline the suite of apprenticeship standards and develop the next phase of reforms. And does that mean that there are going to be fewer apprenticeships available? Or what does that mean? Because it's not very clear at all. And I think we've got some real concerns around about the fact that we want to maintain the availability of high quality apprenticeship standards for all employers, for every occupation. And we would really not want to see some of those standards being taken away. It's particularly the case that historically, people have looked at small volume apprenticeships and said, well, there's only 20 people going through that. Maybe it's not necessary. And we know from the science industries that there are examples of really critical roles in parts of our sector that there may not be high numbers, but those jobs are really important, and we want to see those protected.